This is mic number two. Mic number two.
Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. Hi, everybody. This is just a test.
All right.
Thanks.
We've been trying. No, you should stay in here. Yeah. I will go try one more time and then I can just go inside.
This is for ease. He may show up.
I'll hang on to this here.
Which you may not need. I just.
This should be fun.
I'll leave these here, right here for this.
Good. Anytime.
My cat has a lot of fun with this thing.
Can I go back one slide? Is that all right?
Yeah. Here you go.
Okay.
Another slide. Do you want the mic? It's probably a good idea. The mic. Yep. I'll go. Thumbs up to start.
Good evening, everybody, and thanks for coming. My name is Michael Warby. I am a professor and head of the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, and I'm one of the associate directors of the Bio5 Institute that's sponsoring this symposia series. And I want to start by thanking, we have our director, Jennifer Barton, in the audience here, and want to thank Jennifer for making this possible. I also want to thank Bio5 staff, including Kelly Montez, Lisa Romero, Kate Riley, Amy Randall, and all the others who've helped. I also want to acknowledge Dave Rakeland. Dave, are you here? So Dave is a professor in anthropology, and he generously has supported this with funding, and the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology has also given some support. So this symposium series has been organized by the 4 associate directors of the Bio5 Institute. And what we wanted to do was just get people in a room together talking about all of the things that can contribute to wellness. And so one of the underlying themes is that the solution for you might not be the same as the solution for the person next to you. And so we're looking at this problem through a whole bunch of different lenses, from the genetic diversity that exists in the human population, from the metabolomic diversity that exists, from perspectives of what you can change through behavior and what you can't. And in particular, there's a thread of evolution that runs through these series. So there have been 2 so far on the left there. And tonight we have a real treat to have with us someone who has not just contributed to thinking about how evolution and medicine interact, but he kind of started the field in 1994. Excuse me one sec. With this book called Why We Get Sick. So Dr. Randy Nesse wrote this book with an evolutionary biologist named George Williams. And what they wanted to do was look at this very basic question that doesn't always get asked. And evolutionary biologists are very good at asking questions. And Dr. Nesse, who's a psychiatrist by training, is also very good at asking questions and integrating across a number of fields. He's the foundation professor for life sciences and founding director of the Center for Evolution and Medicine at Arizona State University. He's also an emeritus professor at the University of Michigan, where he was in the departments of psychiatry and psychology. and the Center for Social Evolution, Social Society. Is that right?
Institute for Social Research.
Okay, social research. He's also the founding president of the International Society for Evolution, Medicine, and Public Health. And he has just authored another book called Good Reasons for Bad Feelings that I hope he'll have time to talk a little bit about today. But without taking up any further time, I want to warmly welcome Dr. Randy Nesse.
Thanks so much, Mike, and thanks everybody for coming. I knew I'd have a good time visiting here, but I had no idea how good a time I would have. We keep hearing up in Phoenix that there's this other university that also has a bunch of evolutionary biologists and doctors and others doing things. And I must say, I had no idea just how many people are doing stuff that is so cool. And almost every person I've talked with today does some kind of research that intersects deeply with some of the research of the 12 members of my Center for Evolution Medicine. And we're going to do something to make all that get connected. Too bad about the sports teams fighting each other. We can all have fun together, you know? And it's also a real pleasure. Did you know that you invited me back? How many people remember my previous lecture? It was 10 years and 3 months ago. So I'll come back 10 years from now and give you a follow-up about how we're doing. But it was a little daunting. I said, oh my God, am I using the same slides? There are 2 slides that are the same. But this is a progress report about what's been happening in that 10 years since I talked here before. What is evolutionary medicine? It's nothing more or less than using the basic science of evolutionary biology to better understand, prevent, and treat disease. And it's a two-way street. I'm not going to talk as much about how evolutionary biology benefits from thinking about disease, but that's another theme that we could explore in more detail. But there's a whole lot of evolutionary biology that informs medicine. And I'll tell you the big point for tonight is there's all kinds of great examples. And I'm not going to prove a single one of them. I'm giving them to you because they're cool and they should get you interested in reading more. So don't hold me up saying Nesse didn't prove X. No, they're just examples about how neat this is. But then there's a sad conclusion we're going to come to. No medical school teaches evolutionary biology at all. Now, we'll work into that a little bit. 20 years ago, since actually we wrote this Dawn of Darwinian Medicine article, that's an article in Science talking about the slow, drawn-out dawn about this. And this is a list of publications in evolutionary medicine, which is now out of date. It's continuing to grow exponentially. So this has really been marvelous to watch this grow. A lot of it came from asking a new question. In medical school, we were taught entirely to think about how the body works and what's wrong and how to fix it. But what if you ask a different question? What if you're looking at all of your patients and thinking, who designed this thing? What then? So there's incredible perfection the first 2 years of medical school, right? Incredible. The loop of Henle, if you look and see how that works in your kidney and you don't have a little bit of wondering if evolution could really do that, you're not really understanding it. It's just so incredibly cool. And then there's the heart. Yes, yes, yes. The eyeball seems kind of perfect, but we will come back to it in a little while. The hand is at least as cool. I mean, a hand surgeon, yeah, has to know all that stuff, but a hand surgeon also recognizes this is just incredible. I mean, every single nerve and sinew and cartilage and, oh my goodness. That's the clotting cycle. It better work. And it does. And then the last part is something I didn't like much when I took it in medical school, because you had to memorize a lot of stuff and spit it back. But it turns out that if you study intermediary metabolism from an evolutionary viewpoint, it makes sense and you can remember it. And this is my other theme. If you actually want to teach people about disease and biology, don't just make them memorize the Krebs cycle for a 4th time and spit it back. Try to explain to them why it's there, how it got there, and why it isn't some other way from an evolutionary view. Everything makes more sense. You can actually teach doctors in ways that makes them remember. Then there's the second half of medical school. You see patients in the clinic. Oh my gosh. Wisdom teeth? How many of you are glad you have those? The bone breaks in the same place every time you fall forward. The appendix, thank you very much. Coronary arteries, couldn't they just be a little bit wider, please? The spine, how many of you have back? I don't even ask. Is there anybody who doesn't have back pain? Really? Don't look forward to it. So everybody tries to figure out, why does this person have back pain? Let's pause. Why does almost everybody have back pain? That is the right question to ask. And then there's the last one. Freud tried to figure out what women want. What women want is a zipper. That is just such a terrible, terrible route to begin your life, squeezing your edges. But it can't, why didn't natural selection do better? So Ernst Mayr in Harvard, I think he finished his 18th book when he was 102, something like that. Points out no biological problem is solved until both the proximate and the evolutionary causation has been elucidated. I didn't know there were two different kinds of explanations needed until I was well finished with medical school. I'd had long night bull sessions arguing with people about things, and one of us was arguing about what was the mechanism, and the other was arguing about how that mechanism got that way. I wish somebody just told me. He says, furthermore, the study of evolutionary causes is just as legitimate as the study of the mechanisms. But medical schools only use one half of biology. We study mechanisms. We're like mechanics. We're doctors. How does it work? What's broken? How can we fix it? That's all very important. If you're only going to use half of biology, this is a half to use, because this is more practically useful. But if you're curious about why the body is the way it is, you take an engineer's point of view and you ask, what's the history of this part? Why wasn't the design better? Who the hell designed this? It's gone on quite nicely, actually. This book got, actually, Adaptation, Natural Selection got a lot of it started. Paul Ewald very early got things started, but it's very nice. Steve Stearns has an original book there, an edited one. And here's what's nice, all from Oxford Press, a second edition there, a second edition there, a German version, an article we wrote, the only article in a textbook of medicine still, which is very pathetic. That whole textbook, Oxford Text of Medicine, has this chapter and nothing else about evolution in the book. Robert Pearl has written a very nice book. And this is another second edition, Darwinian Psychiatry, another evolutionary psychiatry one, a Chinese edition. And just this year, last month, the Oxford Handbook of Evolutionary Medicine came out, 700 dense pages for those who are really serious, with organized by organ systems. And this is the book he was mentioning before that I'm very pleased to have out finally, which is applying all of this to mental disorders where it's just desperately needed. And this is just more evidence to share with you about what's been possible, thanks largely to ASU, actually. ASU has made it possible for us to organize an international society, having its 5th annual meeting now in Zurich. I've been editing EvMed Review for a long time, and we've created something called EvMed Ed, 1,500 education resources for the field, open access. This is our Oxford Press Journal. It's really coming along very nicely. In 2009, as you may or may not know, it was Darwin's 200th anniversary of his birth, and also the 150th anniversary of publication of The Origin of Species. If you want to inspire big celebrations, I encourage you to publish your big book when you turn 50. It works very, very well indeed. So everybody all around the world wanted to hear about evolutionary medicine. I went to many panels with lots of wonderful, wonderful speakers, listening to them talk about evolutionary medicine. Here are some of the things I heard from those podia. Aging exists to make room for new individuals so the species can evolve faster. Another one is adult diseases are common because our ancestors only lived till about age 30. Cancer arises from mutations that are needed for evolution to improve the species. New pathogens become mild with time because there's no point in killing your host. And old age diseases exist because selection can't do anything after reproduction stops at the end of menopause. So you've got to forgive me a little bit, okay? Because when you're teaching doctors, they don't pay attention to you unless you kind of bash them over the head a little bit. But here's the trick. All of those are false. Some of them said very confidently by a Nobel laureate. What's going on here if we have doctors saying all these things that are false? They're very smart people, and they're very good scientists, but they've never had a chance to learn even the rudiments of evolutionary biology. And as a result, we are making mistakes in medicine that we shouldn't be making. I'm not going to go through the other versions just to save time, but let's go right on to Darwin's 2 discoveries. Did you know that there were 2 quite different discoveries that Darwin made? I mean, one was that all life is unified. It all came from the same source and evolved. But the other one is why organisms are the way they are. Why is the woodpecker's beak so perfectly adapted to its function? Why do we have eyebrows? That was the age you see how that old guy think, that's when he was thinking about this stuff. Honey creepers, 2 kinds of explanation. One, the phylogeny of all of these shows that they're related, all from a common origin. But the shape of their beaks differs dramatically. Why? Well, Darwin explained that there's variation in the shape of the beaks of individuals within this species, and some of them get nectar better from flowers because the curve and length is just right. And birds like that lay more eggs and have more chicks. And so that shape gets more and more like that as time goes on. 2 halves, phylogeny and genomics, and adaptation and maladaptation. So I'm going to first give you very quick examples of what is more the well-established application of evolution in medicine, including some work by people here. And some of it kind of crosses the boundary between the 2, but this work that now has fabulous new methods using our new genomic data to answer questions that we were unable to answer before, some of which are very practical. Ann Stone is in our center at ASU, and she asked a question about how did tuberculosis show up in mummies in Peru from 500 years before any Europeans came over. And she was able to figure out strategies for getting DNA out of the tubercles from those mummies and show that it actually was tuberculosis from seals. And now she's doing further work on the coast of Alaska, looking at how seals transmit tuberculosis. And she's working with some people here, I think, about strategies for using ancient DNA to trace the history of these kinds of diseases. And here's a good one that Mike might recognize. We've asked ourselves ever since medicine started, 1918 pandemic was a disaster for the world. And when I was a young doctor, we saw patients in a neurology clinic who had Parkinson's disease because they were survivors from this particular pandemic. And we always asked them. And it turned out that many of them were young adults at the time when they got their illness. And it made it so tragic that so many people died because they were in the prime of their life. How come people died at the prime of their life? So Mike decided to try to address that question, and he got genetic data and death data for looking at what ages people died. I won't go into the technical stuff, you might have heard it before, but some people thought that it was because these people had an increased immune response that killed them. And other people said, well, maybe it's just because some of them had immunity because of prior exposure. And something like that second idea looks like it's really true, with big implications for new vaccine suggestions that he's suggesting for the whole world, which may transform our entire way of trying to prevent influenza, one of the greatest killers in the world. A really practical, this is something that started off as a curious guy trying to explain something that was old and may turn into the most profound advance in influenza treatment of our time. Other work from right here is Mike Hammer, looking at genes that are relevant to survival in cold climates. And he started off with the standard way of doing a GWAS, looking for things that are different in those populations than others. But he didn't stop there like some genomicists do. Instead, he started looking at what is the function of those particular ones and what's their significance. And he honed it down not just to 3 genes that have this lovely haplotype pattern, but 3 genes that were significant in terms of their function and their history, as well as their genomic data. And what's really interesting, the next step for this is that these could be risk factors for people in those climates who move to other climates or have kind of modern diets, offering other possibilities for possible interventions. I guess I have that twice. I liked it so much, I put it up twice. Mark Thomas spent a year with me at the Institute for Advanced Study in Berlin, and you all know probably that inability to digest milk makes some people sick. Is that an abnormality? No, most of the human population is like that because that's the normal state. But a few populations are able to digest milk as they grow older, as in adulthood. And Mark was able to take genomic data and see where things began in Europe. So now you have to ask yourself, how come everybody in Northern Europe can digest milk, but some people in Southern Europe can't? And it turns out the selection force acting on these alleles is gigantic. It's among the strongest selection we've ever seen, and it made those populations that had cows grow so fast that people had to migrate, and they moved north. That's grossly oversimplified, but it's still important to think in terms of migration for these things as well as others. Mark Thomas also did this study. He asked, well, tuberculosis is spread in church pews and synagogue pews. You go into a church that's dark and sitting in the Middle Ages, and you're liable to pick up something from somebody else and get tuberculosis. He asked, has there been stronger selection against tuberculosis in areas that are highly urbanized? And sure enough, with this particular allele, that's exactly what he found. In areas that have been urbanized for more centuries, there was a more greater tendency to have the allele that protects you against tuberculosis. So that's what I consider more of the established, solid, reliable half of evolution of medicine. The other half is asking this other question about why didn't natural selection make us more resistant to disease? And the core insight is that it's not just mutation selection balance. There are a lot of explanations. And for every disease, we should consider all the possibilities. Wisdom teeth, childbirth, and spines. My students always say this, how did natural selection shape this disease? And I take my hammer and I beat them on the head and I say, no, natural selection does not shape diseases. No, no. And at the end of the term, there's always a couple who say, I think the evolutionary purpose of schizophrenia is. There's something wrong with human minds. Human minds insist on that kind of thinking, and I think that's an interesting question about why they do that. So that's a bad question. A good question is, why has natural selection left the body vulnerable to this disease? That shift, George Williams and I made this mistake for our first 6 months working together, and it wasn't until we realized that's a mistake, and we shifted. This was the real key to growing this field. That's a good question. The old answer, what I was taught in medical school is, Dr. Nesse, natural selection isn't all powerful. Mutations happen. Don't you know that? Get used to it. Yes, that is a very important explanation, but it's only one. There are 5 others. Pathogens evolve faster than we do. Mismatch with modern environments. Natural selection has things it can't do, like prevent mutations. Every trait is a trade-off, so no trait can be perfect. Selection does not maximize health. I still find this very disturbing. I'm writing about it more and more. Selection maximizes reproduction at the expense of health. And symptoms are adaptations, not diseases. Sorry to go through this quickly. What I'm going to do with the rest of my short time is give you really quick examples of each of these. Again, not proving anything, but just trying to get you interested in asking these questions and try to show you some clinical examples. Why are we continuing to vulnerable to infection? Because E. coli evolved 10,000 times faster than we do. This is a nice slide from Science a few years ago showing what percentage of bacteria are resistant to how many different antibiotics. The average bacteria resistant to 8 antibiotics. So you think to yourself, whoa, have people been getting drugs from their doctors and going peeing on the soil all over the world in these 480 places? No, the answer is really much deeper. That most of our antibiotics come from antibiotics, come from bacteria and fungi because they've been engaged in biochemical warfare with each other for not just thousands of years, but for billions of years. This is a terrible, terrible public health problem now. We thought we were going to solve this. This is from this CDC, I think. This is the greatest death cause in the year 2050 of all. Greater than cancer, greater than diabetes. What are we going to do about this? Invent new antibiotics? Not working. Is there some other approach? So Carl Bergstrom is my mathematical biologist friend who does mathematical modeling for these kinds of things. And some doctors have tried to apply their evolutionary thinking and say, I get it. Let's all doctors in the hospital get together and use one antibiotic for a few months. Then we'll all shift to another one. Then we'll all shift to another one. It sounds kind of good, doesn't it? But if you actually crank the math, that's a pretty good way of creating multi-drug resistance as fast as possible. Whoops. Lack of evolutionary thinking is really a serious problem. Likewise, Andrew Reed has been saying for many years that it might not be best to take every antibiotic. How many people have heard from their doctor, take every pill in the bottle? And your doctors are trying to be evolutionary. If you do the math again, there's no justification for that. And finally, the British Medical Journal last year in December 17, 2017, published an article saying the antibiotic course has had its day. There's no scientific justification for continuing to take the pills after your fever is gone for walking pneumonia. It was done entirely on double-blind controlled trials. And here's the really sad part. Where did they get this idea? It was brute empiricism. There was no mention of prior work, the 15 papers that Andrew and his people wrote, and worse, the word evolution didn't appear in the article. The word phrase natural selection didn't appear in the article. You can tell I get a little riled about this. This is serious. I mean, it's harming public health that doctors are not using well-established science. Finally, 2 days ago, the very first article ever published in The Lancet about evolutionary medicine and infectious disease came out. Microbial evolutionary medicine from theory to practice. We are getting there. But oh man, it's hard. What about cancer? Here's a question. Why didn't natural selection protect us better against cancer? Half of us are going to get cancer. So why didn't natural selection do a better job? And the answer is, it did protect us. I mean, the whole problem with creating multicellular organisms is that those cells keep dividing. And somehow natural selection has to figure out a way to stop those cells from dividing too much in order to make multicellular life possible. That's the great challenge. Josh Schiffman came up to me after one of my lectures when he was just starting medical school at Brown and said, we got to do a project. We did a project on the evolution of the curriculum. We proved definitively that no medical school teaches any evolution. It was really a good project. Now he's doing oncology at University of Utah, and he's done work on Petto's paradox. Did you ever think about the fact that the elephant has at least 10,000 times more cells than the mouse? So if cancer was just a cell going bad, you'd think they have 10,000 times more cancer. But they don't. Why not? Because of natural selection. Natural selection has knocked out. He's actually started a new company now, looking at taking P53, which is a something in the cell that kills off cancer-causing cells, and trying to augment it artificially. And that elephant, he also studies elephants. He thought to himself, well, maybe if P53 stops cancer, there might be more copies in elephants. And talk about a straightforward project that you got to think to do. He went to the zoo, got blood from elephants, and looked for copies of P53. It's not exactly they have extra copies, but they have regulators that greatly increase P53 activity. And that led him to start his company to find out artificial ways of increasing P53 activity to prevent cancer. Breast cancer, it's 10 times more common now than it is for hunter-gatherers. How come? Not for sure, but this is a graph of progesterone levels versus cancer rates in a number of different cultures. And the big insight is that cancers evolve. I was in evolutionary medicine for years before grasping this. Within a tumor, there's a lot of variation between the different cells, and they're competing with each other. And the ones that grow the fastest, grow the fastest. What if you just knock them out with chemotherapy and you're going to kill them all? It turns out what that does is open up the ecosystem around the tumor for the worst ones to grow faster yet. This is an ecological view of cancer within the body. Does it have any practical impact? It certainly does. This is Bob Gatenby, who's done studies of what he calls adaptive chemotherapy. And he gives mice breast cancer and then gives them either no treatment, in which case they die quickly, standard treatment, in which case they die more slowly, or he adjusts the dose of chemotherapy so it's just enough to keep the tumor from growing. And those mice live for a very long time. This is now in human trials for both prostate cancer and breast cancer. I'm so excited. I mean, this is directly from evolutionary thinking. It's leading to a new strategy for chemotherapy. It has not been replicated in anybody else's lab yet. So you got to be cautious, but it's terribly exciting that such a fundamental insight changes how we view cancer and may well revolutionize chemotherapy. Atherosclerosis, with lots of studies on mechanisms, but how come we all have atherosclerosis now? That's a scary one, and it should be scary to all of us because we all have, even those of you who exercise and eat right, this stuff growing in our arteries. One question is, what about the levels of cholesterol in people who live more normal lifestyles? Well, they have cholesterols of 120 to 130 compared to ours at 200. Do they get heart disease? So this is an article by Ben Trumbull, who's in our center, who studies the Chumani in the jungle in Bolivia. And he's hauled a scanner into the jungle and looked for coronary artery calcification as an indicator of heart disease progression. And here is folks like us, like me. By the time you get to my age, you know, it's more than 50% of us have severe coronary artery calcification. But if I had lived in the jungle, it would be more like 8%. And he's found out of 350 years on EKGs, on hardly any of them have ever had a heart attack. Is this just because of exercise and eating right? Maybe, but half of these people also have tuberculosis. They all have worms. Their immune system is completely different from our immune system. And there's a huge need to understand what's really going on to change the rates of atherosclerotic progression. Huge epidemic we're having now. We conquered in many ways these infectious diseases and replaced them with other diseases growing equally fast exponentially. Multiple sclerosis, Crohn's disease, type 1 diabetes, and asthma. Something happened back around 1960 or 70. What is it? Well, we're not quite sure, which is really pathetic again. Everybody's studying the mechanisms of these diseases. So what's causing the epidemic? Some people are trying to help us understand. This is a study on Fleming on multiple sclerosis on different cultures. These are rates of whipworm prevalence. Some of them have a lot of whipworms, and you notice that those that have a lot of whipworms hardly have any MS. Those that have hardly any whipworms have a lot of MS. This has led some people to try worms for treatment for multiple sclerosis. Very inconclusive so far. But this is a key to understanding why multiple sclerosis is becoming more common. And more dramatically, this is data on how antibiotics increase irritable bowel risk. These are 3 different curves for those kids who had not been taking antibiotics, 1 to 2 courses or greater than 2 courses, and the rate of irritable bowel disease is, you know, again, 50, 70% higher in the kids who've had multiple courses of antibiotics. We should not be just telling patients, your child doesn't need an antibiotic because it's a virus. We should be telling people, if your child takes an antibiotic, the risk of having an autoimmune disease later in life is higher. So let's think carefully about this before we do anything. This is of inestimable practical value in the clinic. Last, we were going to talk about painful symptoms. This is where I come in. I'm a psychiatrist. I was seeing all these people with pain syndromes and anxiety. And you have to ask yourself, and my new book does this in great detail, by the way, to ask, why on earth are so many of us anxious and depressed all the time? You'd think somebody really goofed in designing that part. Whoops. I've been disconnected. I really shouldn't talk about this stuff. It's too detailed. So there are 2 kinds of problems people bring to doctors. Defects, body just is not working right. But most of the problems we bring to our doctors are protective responses. Fever, cough, pain, anxiety, and I would call it low mood. Those would not exist except natural selection shaped them to go off in situations when they're useful. Why do they go off too much? Well, for panic attacks, and I've treated probably 1,000 people with panic attacks, your heart pounds, you get short of breath, you feel like you got to run out of the room, you start sweating. It's a terrible thing. People feel very worried that they're going to die. Why do so many people have those? Well, it's a fight-flight response. A good one if there's a lion chasing you, but not good if you're in fries. That guy's around, you should run. So here's the question. How loud a noise should there be behind that rock before you flee? Well, it depends. It depends on the cost of fleeing. Call it 200 calories. Depends on the cost of not fleeing. If there's a lion there, call it 200,000 calories. It turns out that the ratio is 1,000 to 1. So you should flee every time the sound is loud enough to indicate that a lion is there with a probability of greater than 1 in 1,000. You know what that means? That means that 999 panic attacks out of 1,000 will be unnecessary in the instance, but still perfectly normal. When I first went through this, I thought, this has got to be a mistake. This is a bad design. No, this is how it has to. This is like your smoke detector. You have a house like this. You want your smoke detector to go off every time there might be a fire so that you don't die in that kind of a fire. The cost of your smoke detector going off is low. The cost of it not going off could be death, just like a panic attack. This is profoundly important for all of the decisions doctors make every day. What doctors do mostly in the clinic is give drugs that block normal defenses to make people feel better. Pain, fever, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, these are all normal defenses, and doctors are making decisions about whether to block them, usually without understanding the science that goes on to determine when it's safe and when it's not. And finally, what I've been working on more recently is complex genetic diseases. In the year 2000, we were all sure we were going to find the genes that cause all these terrible diseases. And to say it's a disappointment is so much of an understatement. I mean, the newspapers keep saying, oh, we found some new, no. The answer is for schizophrenia, bipolar disease, autism, diabetes, there are no common genes that increase your risk by even 1%. Notice I said common genes, there's some rare genes, but our hopes have been dashed. We were thinking wrong about these diseases, and we're still not thinking clearly, in my opinion. There are a bunch of explanations, like mutations happen and the like. A lot of them are genetic quirks that are harmful only in modern environments. I love Ken Weiss's quote here. It says, highly heritable disease are mostly caused by environments. That doesn't seem to make any sense, but think about it for a minute. If there was a gene that caused a disease for the past million years, it would have been gotten rid of. It's only genes that were harmless in those times and interact with something now, like the Big Mac gene. If you like Big Macs, you're in trouble if there's a gene for that. Myopia is a fine example. When I was in medical school, I said, how come natural selection doesn't get rid of this highly heritable disease that would make me lunch for a tiger? And my professor said, well, mutations happen. No. Myopia hardly happens in hunter-gatherer populations. It's only if you read early in life or do some other abnormal things that you get myopia if you have the genes. But is it reading? Is it not enough light? Is it too much sugar? No one knows. People are still arguing about it. The Chinese have set a rule that all children must spend at least 1 hour every day outdoors in the sunlight because they believe that lack of exposure to bright light is responsible for the myopia epidemic. But no one really knows what's going on here. And this is what I've been preoccupied by. This is going to be very brief, but we can talk about it later. Our standard model for genetic disease assumes a symmetrical fitness curve so that, the length of your bones or how much glucose you have or how much acid you have in your stomach. If you have a medium amount, you do better than other people. If you don't have enough acid in your stomach, you're liable to get infections. If you have too much, you're liable to get ulcers. Almost every trait in the body is at some middle zone. If you have mutations, it kind of spreads out this distribution and makes you sick. Okay. But it turns out, well, what if this curve is not symmetrical like that? And I wrote an article a number of years ago about genetics of schizophrenia, which I'm now taking much more seriously. What if the curve is shaped like this? So this individual here is going to have more children than anybody else on that curve. But what about those children? Well, these are the children, and about a third of them are going to have values way down here, and they're going to be sick. And then the second thing I've done is try to understand, so where does natural selection push the average for that trait? It pushes it down here to the level that maximizes the fitness, not of the individual, but of the individual's children. And interestingly, that still leaves a few individuals off the cliff. Exactly what we find with many of these dread diseases. Schizophrenia cuts your reproduction by half. So does autism. But 2 to 3% of the population have some version of those diseases. Why doesn't natural selection get rid of them? People say mutations happen. I don't know. I think it might be that it's not the problem with the genes, it's the problem with the shape of the fitness function. And if I've lost you a little bit, it's not your fault. What I'm saying is kind of a little complicated. We can talk about it later if you want to, but this is what I've been thinking about most recently to try to understand genetic disease. This is, if you had a level here, you would have the minimal chance of disease. And interestingly, those individuals have fewer offspring, even in the next generation than these. So natural selection does not maximize health. Alzheimer's will be my concluding one. For the last 15 years, we've been trying to figure out what's wrong with beta amyloid, because beta amyloid is the stuff that makes plaques and tangles that kills off your neurons. We've been acting like it's a toxic byproduct. Does that make any sense evolutionarily? People say, well, it doesn't matter because you're past. It turns out that this is an article by Socia, 2010, showing that if you just take beta amyloid, this supposedly toxic stuff, it kills microbes very nicely. And just in the last year, Tenzi and Moir at Harvard have shown that if you inject stelmanella typhi into a brain of a mouse amyloid goes right around it and immobilizes it. It also does the same for fungi. It's a potent antimicrobial. I think what's actually going on with Alzheimer's disease is a trade-off between the potent antimicrobial actions and their costs. But I'll just emphasize here, and for all the examples I've given you, I haven't proven this. And every one of these things needs at least an hour lecture just to summarize the evidence for and against different ideas. But every one of them gives you new ideas about research that needs to be done. We've made great progress. Used to be everybody said, what's evolutionary medicine? Now people say, how can we teach it? I wish everybody would just ask that. This is a special issue of PNAS, which is now outdated, where a bunch of us got together to make recommendations for medical school curricula. And I'd like to sadly tell you it's had no effect whatsoever on medical schools. Medical schools are locked in to teaching to the exam, and they don't have evolutionary biologists on their faculty. Here you have a better chance in most places because you have close connections with the medical school, and Bio5, I think, is a great opportunity to make these kind of connections. But most places, they don't have the ability to do it. We've just finished a study looking at the percentage of schools that are research universities. Almost half of them have a specific course in evolutionary medicine, and 92% have teaching about evolutionary medicine. So we come from nothing to a bunch of young people getting up to speed pretty well in the field. And likewise, programs have started, not sure where that one is, maybe Poland, and there's one in the UK, and there's one in India, and there's one in Australia, New Zealand, there's one at Duke. That's one, I think it's supposed to be us, but the stars move around on PowerPoint sometime. But we're doing pretty well, and it's been so thrilling to see that, now that some people have started programs in evolution medicine and found that students are fascinated, more and more programs are starting up. And I think this will gradually, eventually, and these people will grow up to become deans eventually, and so eventually things will change. So that's the end. The theme is very simple. Medicine can benefit from evolutionary biology. It's going to take a lot more work and careful studies, but it sure gives you interesting ideas. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Let's take a few minutes of questions, and then we can break for a few minutes, grab some food and wine, and then come back. So question at the back.
So my earpiece amplifies my voice, but not yours. So could you say that again, please?
I'm wondering whether the same is true of the current course of treatment for cancer if you're taking different kinds of drugs. Taking one until it becomes resistant, and then adding another one, and adding another one.
So I don't think you can say it doesn't jive exactly. I'll just emphasize again, I don't think evolution ever tells you what to do in the clinic directly. And if your doctor says, I do evolutionary medicine, you should probably run. Because that doctor is probably going to give you advice based on theory instead of based on studies. On the other hand, every single one of these things can be informed by better studies. In cancer treatment in particular, we have colleagues at Mayo who are really into evolution in cancer, and they tell us what they're doing for multiple myeloma is trying cocktails of drugs that seem to work in some people. And what we're hoping to do, and precision medicine offers you opportunities of trying to trace not just the genotype of that person's cancer, but the phylogeny and how that cancer is evolved within that individual as a way of trying to predict which drugs are going to work in what sequence. And it's giving us very good new ideas.
I also had a question about the antibiotics. So my understanding of the origin of the course was twofold. I mean, first was the original penicillin, where they ran out of drugs and the guy died, and that wasn't fairly obviously not from resistance, but from running out of the drug. And then the second instance being tuberculosis, where there's still excellent evidence, was my understanding, that it is actually necessary to finish the course, as opposed to, for example, your example of walking pneumonia. And, the way I think of this is it depends on whether competitions among bacteria, among the pathogen, are relative versus absolute, controls whether you should finish a course or not, which needs to be an empirical question, whether or not it's informed by evolution in each and every pathogen.
And it's appropriate to say, hey, Dr. Nesse, those British doctors who proved that you didn't need to take the whole course just for walking pneumonia, they were very specific about that. They weren't even thinking evolutionarily, so why do you need evolution? And the answer to that is they could have done it 10 years previously if they had been reading work by evolutionary biologists. But you're quite right that every single one depends not only on what infection you have, but on your genome and how it interacts with those things. And now we're back to personalized medicine. I mean, it should be possible to predict who is going to get better faster, who needs a longer course and who needs a shorter course. I think we're on the verge of that.
Is there any harm for how much we keep treating tuberculosis? Clearly a disease for which they do need to take antibiotics for a long time, or else you will get resistance.
Yeah. So does stopping your drug cause increased resistance? I don't know.
In tuberculosis.
I don't. I mean, and the key here we're talking about is, does resistance emerge within an individual, which certainly happens. HIV, I mean, resistance occurs because of evolution within an individual, or does it occur from a mutation which spreads? For instance, malaria is resistant to chloroquine because of a mutation that originated apparently in Southeast Asia someplace, and now is in South America. And it did not show up again in South America. They can trace it back to its origins. So each one needs individual assessment for these. Generalizations won't do it.
One more question before we break.
I'm curious about how would you define disease as a trait that we can study in terms of evolutionary studies?
Oh, that's such a wonderful question. She says, how can you define disease? And I went to a conference in Denmark like 20 years ago, and Denmark is a special place. They had an institute for philosophy and medicine with 7 full-time faculty, only in Denmark. And they put us up in a nice hotel and had us talk for 4 straight days about defining disease. And this gave me an opportunity to write a paper called On Evolution and the Difficulty of Defining Disease, to which I refer you for why I can't answer your question. With that, let's take a break.
So you're either the exact right person or the exact wrong person to answer that. Let's come back in 10 minutes. Thank you so much, Randy. Fantastic. And,
Try to make it so we would have.
All right, everyone, let's get going again. Thanks for coming back. We are now going to have a panel discussion. And so 2 of our panelists are up there. Randy, if you don't mind joining them. And what we're going to do is have each of our guest panelists talk for a few minutes about their own work. And then we will take questions for all 3 panelists and have a discussion and see what sort of connections we can make here. So our first panelist is Dr. Joanna Maisel. She's a professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, and she is one of the world's foremost experts on what we call population genetics. Joanna is going to tell us about how her research is providing some new insights into how population genetics can inform health. Do you want to come up here or just? Sure, why don't you do that?
Marvelous. So, thank you. Thank you very much, Mike. So yes, I am indeed that weird species, also known as a theoretical population geneticist. And so we dabble in everything, and we're well known to know evolution, to know statistics too. I do a bunch of things that might be relevant that I'm not going to talk about, particularly to do with deleterious loads of mutations, to do with the reasons that proteins misfold, including the evolutionary reasons. But today I'm going to focus just on the work of one postdoc, Paul Nelson, who's not here because he's off at a wedding. He really should be giving this instead of me, but I'm going to talk about his work. Got messed up the animation. Oh, well, you lost the punchline. I'm going to talk about somatic evolution. So the organism is a bunch of cells. The cells are a population. They compete, they evolve. The population of cells evolves. And it's really very simple that the cells have 2 things. They can compete with each other, and when they compete with each other, some of them will evolve to be better, and then we're going to die of cancer, and we're going to die at increasing rates with age. And there's really only one other option, which is the cells don't compete, and when they don't compete, we die of cells that are useless, not getting weeded out by the competition. And that also increases with age. And here's where the picture's supposed to appear, which is the punchline that we're all going to die. So my field of theoretical, and deteriorate first. Sorry, I forgot the good news. So, my field, I'm basically representing team nihilism here. Then that's a strong tradition of theoretical population genetics is we're very good at saying why it's all hopeless, which is why we really need biomedical scientists who are sort of so much more optimistic. But we're very good at explaining what really doesn't work. So, essentially we came up with a mathematical proof that there is no immortality and that aging is absolutely inevitable. So some people who believe in the singularity were disappointed, and I got lots of, this is the only time in my professional life I got coverage by the what's it called, the Daily Mail and stuff, because the tabloid reading public loves to be told that there was a fancy mathematical proof for something they already knew. But there is a serious take-home from this work, despite all that. And the serious take-home work is what's really important, and this gets back to what Randy was saying about trade-offs, is the mediating the trade-offs and what mediates the trade-off. And in this work, what mediates the trade-off is how much the cells are competing, and that is the balance between cells getting sluggish and useless and senescent and cells getting cancerous. And and when you look across comparative, which is something else evolutionary biologists do, the data is just striking. So say Drosophila larvae get cancer, the adults generally don't, except they do in their gut. You look where the cells are competing, that's exactly where the cells are competing. C. elegans, which most of you know, has an exact precise number of cells. They don't compete because they're kind of numbered. Oh, except for in the potential germ cells. Those guys compete and they can get cancers there. Plants, cancer is much less dangerous in a plant because there's cell walls. We have metastases. Metastases are awful. They're the worst part of cancer. Plants have cancer and we say, oh, look at that lovely branching pattern. How pretty. I'll have it as an ornamental, please. And so, you know, because cancer is just not such a big deal for plants, they can change it and you'll find their apical memory stem is actually designed to maximize the amount of somatic competition, whereas so many human tissues are designed to minimize the amount of competition. So, you know, that's a sort of a way of thinking of it and sort of a suggestion to people who do something less nihilistic and more useful than me to develop research programs better at quantifying and paying attention to that trade-off. I'll just talk about briefly another. So that was in PNAS, if you want to look it up, a couple of years ago. This one just came out on bioRxiv yesterday. So there's been a lot of excitement in the field of aging, like somebody came up with 353 methylation sites, and if you measure those, then you have this perfect precision wellness marker of your biological age. And so we sort of just did some simulations to see what would happen. And, you know, and what will happen is over time, you see your methylation sites will flip and become something they're not supposed to be. And yeah, sure, it'll mark your age. But if you do a statistical run where you have some of those sites that are important and some of those that are not important, well, all the ones that flip that are important, they cause people to die. And so there's this thing called cohort selection within a single generation, and they're not in your data set, you don't measure them. And so this whole process of choosing this 353 biomarkers for age is basically deliberately choosing biomarkers that do absolutely nothing, less than you'd expect if you chose biomarkers by chance. Which I think is just important context. Okay, that's my 5 minutes. I'm up.
Thanks, Joanna. Next up, we have Anita Koshi. Anita is a clinician and a researcher in the departments of immunobiology and neurology here at the University of Arizona. And she is one of the world's foremost experts on a pathogen that is residing in the brains of many of us in the room. Anita.
That's pretty much it. That's the punchline. Okay, so I work on a parasite called Toxoplasma gondii, and I'm on the medical end of it, so we do a lot about treating and thinking about that, but I'll try and convince you that there's some interesting things to be learned about toxo because it does talk about the evolution of how we co-evolve with microbes. So this is Toxoplasma gondii. It's a eukaryotic organism, means it has a nucleus, has a huge host range. And it has basically where the parasite interacts with other parasites is in the catgut, but you don't need to know anything about that for what I do. But this host range runs from birds to humans. And that's all been naturally documented. And when, as a human or any intermediate host, when you get your toxo, you ingest contaminated food or water. The parasite then sort of flips into this fast growing phase. It goes all over your body. The immune system comes in and clears it out, except for in humans and rodents. In any animal, it will generally persist in most animals, but in humans and rodents, the place it persists best is the brain. And that's fine for most of us, but it can have some deleterious effects as well. So this is what most people, I'll get to the numbers in a moment, but most people's brain looks like with Toxoplasma, which is normal. This is just pulled off the internet. I can't tell who in this room has Toxoplasma and who doesn't. If you are unfortunate enough to get Toxoplasma in utero, especially in the first trimester, this is what congenital toxoplasmosis looks like. This is why women are not supposed to change kitty litter. It's actually Toxoplasma. If you have Toxoplasma and you look and you're normal here, and then you get acquired immunodeficiency, such as AIDS patients, that ability to persist then is a huge problem because it can then reactivate. And these are all little lesions of the parasite having reactivated. And then the last example is just, this is an eye that's, again, I pulled off the internet. But even in immunocompetent people, Toxoplasma will go to the retina naturally. If you get your Toxoplasma lesion in a part of your retina where you use for vision, then it'll cause vision problems and you'll go see your eye doctor. So the CNS is a key organ for toxoplasmosis clinical disease, which is why we study it. The disease burden is about 1/8 to 1/3 of the human population is chronically infected, so 10 to 25% in the US. That leads to about 4,400 hospitalizations, 300 deaths. Congenital cases are been hard estimates to get in the US because it's not well tracked, about 200,000 worldwide. And symptomatic retinitis is about 5,000 cases a year. They estimate, this is all from the CDC, about 20,000 asymptomatic cases a year, meaning that people have the lesions, it's just not in a part that affects their vision. And the reason for, as a clinician, this is interesting to us is that when it reactivates or you have an active infection, we can treat that, but we can't cure anyone of their toxin. So you have it in your brain, it's going to be there for the rest of your life, we think, and there's nothing we can do about it. And in general, that's not a problem. And so my lab studies just why does toxoplasma persist? And our sort of argument is that it's evolved to persist in the mammalian CNS. If we understand how it's evolved to do that, maybe we can find ways to cure you of that disease, but it's also very unusual. So there basically isn't another microbe that you can think of that persists in the brain or in the CNS. So things like herpes virus or varicella zoster, so chickenpox, they actually exist outside of the CNS. They exist in what's called the peripheral nervous system. And when they cross into the brain is when you get symptoms. And so that means that toxo evolves a very unique niche, and it's done it across a number of animals. And so then you can use this, you can think of that as having co-evolved together to tolerate each other. And so then you can use this this parasite to understand the CNS immune response. So why is toxo able to survive and why doesn't it just get cleared out, or what keeps the immune response from being so vigorous? And the reason that's important is that the CNS immune response is thought to be involved in a huge number of neurodegenerative diseases. Like it's become very hot in thinking about why it's sort of cuts across a number of things from Parkinson's to ALS to MS, of course, and then to Alzheimer's disease. And so there's also the last thing is that some people have questioned, because it's so prevalent, if toxo affects human behavior. I'm not going to get into that, but we can talk about it in the discussion if you want to, what the data is or is not for that. So that's sort of why we do what we do. And this is just our big goal, is to understand how the CNS and toxo interacts. And this is a mouse. We have a sort of a trick in which the mouse is infected, and we have a way in which we can get the cells that have been interacting with toxo to express a GFP, the screen fluorescent marker, so we can track them. And I like this picture because it's really nice in terms of an evolutionary point, which is that you can see that this part of the brain doesn't have many green cells, right? But this part over here has lots. And so this part back here is what we share with reptiles, right? It's really important. That's where things like breathing, driving your heart, things like that reside. Up here is more of where the mouse figures out how to get to food, things like that. So important, but not quite as important as breathing, right? And so you can imagine that if you're going to evolve with a pathogen, if your pathogen always goes here, it's not going to do very well because it's likely to kill you. So I refer to that part of the brain as high-priced real estate. But if you're up here, and this is true for humans as well, if you're up here in what's called the cortex, we can tolerate a fair amount of inflammation and destruction in our cortex and still do all the things we need to do. And so on that level, I think it's fascinating to see that toxo and the mammalian CNS have evolved. So it comes here, it comes to the part of the brain where it can tolerate it. And I think that's it. That's my lab. And so thank you.
All right. So any questions from the audience to start things off? And can you try to project your voice like a stage actress?
I would be very much interested to know how you and what you think about CBD staff with neurodegenerative diseases.
What is CBD staff?
It's cannabis.
Oh, cannabinoids. I'm not the right person to ask because that has nothing to do with toxo, but I don't think that, again, for most of these things, what Randy has said is that exactly right, which is for most things, we really need data. And there's lots of problems with the studies that have been done with neurodegenerative diseases, part of which is that if you think about, when you're 80, 30, when you hit the 80s, 30% of that population will have Alzheimer's disease is sort of the common estimate. but that means neuropathy, there is more evidence for it helping with the pain. And so I think there's evidence for that, but most of the studies, they haven't been totally rigorous studies. People are now beginning to do rigorous studies and everything from seizures to neuropathy. And that's really where we stand in terms of actually treating patients, is we don't have the evidence.
One of the main contentions between evolutionary medicine and traditional medicine seems to me to be how to treat the course of the dose of the treatment, the antibiotics. And we have the example of the pneumonia, which is a fast-acting tuberculosis. Now, I'm not a mathematical modeler, but it strikes me this might be an ideal situation for modeling whether the treatment depends in part on how fast the organism is reproducing. And if it's a slower one, it may take a longer treatment than a faster one.
So I think, should I say, there is a bunch of really good mathematical modeling on this. And what it depends on is whether competition is mostly relative or absolute. So in absolute competition, where it's not really competing against the rest of the microbiome or the organism or whatever, host or whatever, you need to kill every single last cell to make sure you don't get any antibiotic resistance. And so when it's absolute competitions, you need to massively treat as hard as possible. And when it's a relative contest, where there's competition with the rest of the microbiome, with the host cells and so on, you just have to give them enough of a disadvantage, such as the other cells kick in, then you want to treat as lightly as possible. And so you can get either out of the mathematics, and it's not about generation time or anything, it's about the degree to which the competition is relative versus absolute. And unfortunately, you know, it's very hard to predict that a priori. So at the end of the day, what's suggested is, you know, is that we find out, and it can be different. And so, you know, it can be different for TB and for walking pneumonia, and who knows what it is for all the very many diseases for which it has not been tested.
Very quick comment. I don't think there should be any, evolutionary medicine is not a method of treatment. It's not a school of treatment. It's just evolution added to regular medicine. Traditional medicine, you can do medicine without evolution, which is what we're doing now, which is kind of pathetic. Or you can do medicine with evolution, which is what I'm suggesting. But any recommendation about treatment comes from studies.
I wondered, with the prevalence of toxoplasmosis, you were saying about 25% of the population presents with it. Have you looked at the correlation between it and development of AD or Alzheimer's?
So so first there's a couple things. One, the way we diagnose whether or not you have toxo or not is toxo seropositivity. So they take some blood and check whether or not you have antibodies. And let me make this disclaimer now. Whenever I give a talk that goes into these areas, I don't think everyone should run out and get their toxo antibody tested. There is nothing anyone's going to do for you because we can't treat that chronic disease, right? So don't do it. But so the people have looked at toxo seropositivity and all sorts of things. The most famous one is schizophrenia. And the problem with that, they've looked at in Alzheimer's, they've looked at the problem with the way that those studies run, and just this is why I work in mice and not in humans, is that I take a population, I look at their antibodies and I say, oh, this antibody is more common in the Alzheimer's disease person versus the non-Alzheimer's disease person. Well, that doesn't tell you whether or not the parasite is causing the disease versus there's something about that population that puts them more at risk. And you can see this in Alzheimer's in the sense that, or this is the data that's out there, has not controlled for socioeconomics and education, which are two things that sort of predict, there's this theory about cognitive reserve, sort of what percentage of people will get Alzheimer's disease, right? And so like many diseases, toxoplasma is more prevalent in people who are on the lower end of socioeconomics and lower cognitive, not cognitive, but lower socioeconomics and therefore often lower education. And so they don't control for those. And so the popular press will report all sorts of things, but they've never controlled for those as far as I know.
So we heard about atherosclerosis and its, how its prevalence might be related to having other ailments or worms in the body, stuff like that. I'm wondering if we know anything along those lines regarding diabetes.
So the rate of diabetes type 1 has been increasing dramatically just in the last 30 years. It's an autoimmune disease that kills off beta cells in the pancreas, completely different from diabetes type 2, which is a type more associated with obesity and living in modern environments. So two very different diseases. We thought we were going to find the specific genes causing these heritable diseases, and it turns out that there are lots and lots of them, and they each have a teensy effect. So this is a great example of something where we have interactions between genes and environments in ways that are essential to make sense out of it. Not sure that really answers your question, but.
Can I just, since we had a symposium last week that kind of potentially touches on that, I just want to mention that for people who didn't see it. Herman Ponzer talked about studying this hunter-gatherer group called the Hadza in sub-Saharan Africa. And the remarkable thing about that group was that they have 10 times the physical activity that we have in North America, but they burn about the same number of calories per day. And how is that possible? Herman's evidence seems to suggest that we burn a whole bunch of extra calories through increased inflammation and stress responses. So possibly, maybe there's some link between being sedentary, increased inflammation, which can then contribute to diseases like diabetes. Mike?
For Dr. Nesse, you referred to autism, and I don't really know the latest epidemiological evidence, but can you discuss in terms of an evolutionary model why we might be seeing increasing rates of autism? And I can think of a couple of ideas.
Go ahead.
And you're gonna be able to do much better than this, but one would just be mutation. If you have a disease that could be caused by lots of genes, so there's a big mutational target, could we have something be going on in the population? And I'm ignoring environmental factors for now, where we are introducing more mutations in the population.
Hold it up, please.
Okay, we're introducing maybe more mutations. Maybe with the age of the father, we know that men are the primary problem with introducing new mutations, like SNPs into the population. Not chromosomal abnormalities, but or something like you were alluding to, where you have too much of a good thing, perhaps selection leading to something that's being optimized, but then goes over the cliff.
So I may spend the next several years of my life trying to understand autism instead of helping medical curricula develop, because it's such a fascinating disease, 5 times more common in men. Why is that? And ADHD is also way more common in men, and also mental retardation is way more common in men. What is wrong with men? You know? Actually,
We only have 20 minutes left, so we're not going to be able to answer that.
Actually, Dan Kruger and I wrote a series of papers explaining why men have problems in general. Here's a quick question for you, just for fun. For every 100 women aged 20 in Arizona this year who die, sadly, how many men will die? If women die more, it would be like, 80. If men die more, it might be 110 men versus something like that. How many people can I get to go to 110? 120? 150? Actually, there's no time to do this properly, but when I did this study, I got data from the World Health Organization, and it turns out to every 100 women who die in Arizona this year at age 20, 300 men are going to die. Yeah. And very significantly, we found that all 19 leading causes of death are higher for men throughout the lifespan, except for one, and that's Alzheimer's disease. And there's something about the immune response or something that's damaging the brain that accounts for Alzheimer's. But you asked about autism. I'm so excited about this. I want to, what can I say in 2 sentences that's useful about this? There's something about, there's this, because women have 2 X chromosomes, you got to turn one of them off. Otherwise, they get a double dose of other things, good things. And my hypothesis about this is extremely simple. It is, there's this particular molecule called X-ist, which is expressed, which goes down the X chromosome of one of the 2 X chromosomes in women and turns it off selectively. It's a methylation kind of thing. So here's the idea, very simply, you heard it here first. What happens if that accidentally gets turned on in a man? It's going to knock out all kinds of genes that are otherwise essential. And many of those genes are involved in cognition. And I'd just like to see if people who have these neurodevelopmental syndromes have any signals of X-ist expression, which is an easy experiment to do if anybody knows an autism brain bank handy.
So just to also, I think you also asked, like, why might the rate have recently increased? And a simple evolutionary possibility is an increase in the rates of assortative mating, that people who exhibit what you could consider subclinical inclinations in the autistic direction, and I'm sure all of us in academia are acutely familiar with such people, are more likely to marry each other, and that is sufficient to bring on a very large increase in the number of people exceeding a threshold.
It's called Caltech.
But the last little bit of that is also that there is definitely some concern that like the definition of autism has changed. And that's also led to this sort of bump. That's not actually a bump.
Thank you. I've been hearing a lot about the quality of your gut health is very important for your overall health and for many diseases. Would you like to comment on that?
Seems right. But the people who are doing work on this are able to demonstrate that the gut microbes in people who have obesity and other things are different from the gut microbes in other people. But here's how you can change your gut microbes. Eat a Snickers bar. Your gut microbes change almost within hours. A very interesting and speculative idea is that maybe your microbes are influencing your behavior in a way to get you to eat things that those particular microbes benefit from. I thought that was preposterous until some people actually did gut transplant studies in mice and showed that mice that had been, if you transplant the microbes, they start eating sweets. So maybe there's something to it. Should you go out and start using, what do they call them? The good probiotics. I've been talking to world experts about that, and the answer is maybe, but there's no great.
I'd add to that, if you're going to have probiotics, be really, really careful where you buy them from, because these are people who are growing up a whole bunch of microbes, and anything could be growing in it unless the quality control is really good. So don't go and buy the cheapest probiotics you can find, whatever you do.
I'm telling a very short story about being a psychiatrist, seeing young women usually as a consultation like 40 years ago. And the surgeons and internists kept sending these women to me saying, this person has diarrhea. We've checked. There are no pathogens in her stool. She's having diarrhea 15 times a day. She's clearly anxious, and it must be a psychogenic problem. And I would examine the person and find out, and I would say, this person is anxious. It's because she's having diarrhea 15 times a day and she can't go do anything. And they would get very mad at me saying, we've shown that there are no abnormalities. But here's what's pathetic. All of us, professional doctors, we were thinking that germs are bad. Talk about a naive view that was widely held throughout the entire, we're thinking germs are bad. No, what these doctors have done is wipe out all the good stuff in this person's gut. Now we know that a lot of these women had C. difficile infections, and a gut transplant could fix them. I mean, this is really pathetic.
Just to round that discussion out, there's basically no evidence that commercial probiotics are good for anything. That's one thing. But there's very strong evidence that if you ramp up your soluble fiber intake, it's incredibly good for your microbiome in your gut. And there are all sorts of benefits from immunity to brain health for doing that. And our diets have, a tenth of the fiber of the diets that the people that last week's speaker studies.
So I'm wondering how we can kind of translate all those to help patients. Because I'm a clinician, a lot of times they come in, they don't want you, they want you to treat the fever. Because if you don't treat, they think you're a bad doctor. So how can we educate them?
So Mark Schwartz runs the internal medicine training program at NYU, and he's become a very sophisticated evolutionary person as well. And he says that the most useful thing that we have to offer is explaining to our patients about what diseases are and what the significance of these symptoms is. If we explain to them, cough is actually useful, people who don't cough die of pneumonia. If we explain to them that fever is the signal that your body sends to all the cells in the body to ramp up defenses, then they understand it better. If we explain to them that giving an antibiotic is liable to cause more harm to you in the long run in terms of your risk of autoimmune disease than benefits, I don't think we should, just explaining things helps.
Yeah, but the problem is the healthcare system.
Yeah,
The
so-
system does not reward clinicians. And all the
Yeah.
advertisement of the medication.
Well, so I think there, right. So I think there's two things. So yeah, there's good data, right? That spending more time with your patient matters. So we have to get to a place where I am, right? So where they get to a place where we pay for people to spend time with their patients. And then the second thing is that in systems, so if you look at Kaiser, they're really effective at not giving antibiotics because you can go from one Kaiser doc to the next and they're all going to say no, right? And if you go outside of their system, you're going to have to pay for it. And so there is a utility to everyone being on the same page. But it's very hard when it's like, well, if I go to you, you're not going to give me antibiotics. So I'm going to go to this person and they will give me antibiotics to make me happy, right? And so some of it is, I think all of us as clinicians have to be on the same page, right? And we also have to say, hey, we don't know all the time, right? Right. Like I'm all about single payer, so.
Hi, I just wanted to clarify the last comment about fiber. I wasn't at that presentation, but you used the word specifically insoluble fiber. Did you?
Soluble.
Okay, okay, soluble fiber. You did mean soluble specifically, not insoluble. Is that correct?
Insoluble is good, but soluble fiber is
the more-
food for beneficial microbes that live in your gut.
Had the greater push. Okay, thank you.
So what should people eat to get soluble fiber?
My allergist said, just forget trying to get enough in your diet because it's hard, and just put some benefiber or inulin in your coffee each time you have a cup of coffee. And oh, he did say that. He really did say that.
Does he drink coffee?
He does.
I have a question about chemotherapy in one of the
Please hold it up
slides.
very close so we can hear you.
I have a question about chemotherapy. In one of the slides you showed previously was that less is better. However, from what I read, is you mean immunotherapy is taking the place of chemotherapy. So where do you see that as fitting in? Good, bad?
One of the Mayo Medical students who came, and we do an intensive course for Mayo Medical students where we have them for, all week, all hours. And he had been doing research on immunotherapy for a couple of previous years before he started medical school. And he finished up our course and did a poster for our society meeting. And the poster essentially said, how come immunotherapists are always giving just one drug and hoping it's going to work because it never works for that long? How come they're not recognizing that triple drug therapy, which is what we use for chemotherapy and what we use for antibiotics to prevent resistance, how come they don't use multi-agents all at the same time? And the answer was, gosh, nobody ever really thought about that. It's past time to not just assume that, I mean, if an immunotherapy can cure you, that's great. But we should be thinking about the fact that resistance develops to immunotherapy just like to everything else. We should be thinking in evolutionary terms right from the beginning of developing new immunotherapies.
I'll also sort of flip side. I'm a nihilist, so I'm just gonna put that out there. But one of the problems with immunotherapies, and I just saw this actually in December, right? If you're unleashing your immune system, there are reasons you're actually, other immune cells in your immune system try to tamp down on it. And so in December, I saw several people who had now been on immunotherapies and now were having autoimmune problems, right? So there's always two sides to that coin. And you could have predicted that with the immune therapies. They're going to be great for some patients. For some patients, they're going to turn on a massive, terrible autoimmune problem. And they're seeing that now.
So we seem to have a little lull here where we don't have questions. And I actually wanted to start a conversation between Anita and Randy. So Randy, you've been trying for many years to get evolutionary medicine into the curriculum of actual medical school students. And so what are the real obstacles? Do people understand that it would be good, but there are so many other things competing with it that they just feel it's not good enough compared to the other things that would have to be chopped out? Why is it so hard to get this changed?
But you want to argue about something?
No, discuss, since you're both clinicians.
Okay. So I've spent many years trying to do this, and I never give up, but I'm on the verge of realizing that you're really fighting inexorable economic and social forces when you try to do something new in medicine. And it's not just, how long did it take to get biochemistry into the medical curriculum? About 40 years. And even genetics is still hardly in the curriculum for most doctors. But to answer your question, whenever I go to visit someplace, I say, I'll come if you can put me in touch with the dean. And several deans have said very straightforwardly after a few drinks, it's interesting, I'd like to do it, but I have so many donors who are creationists, I don't want to, it's not worth it. That's a serious issue. I mean, deans are not able to, it's a big deal. And they have students who will complain. There are always some students who complain after students after I give a lecture often create a new club, and then some other students complain that, this is, even though this isn't anti-religion in any way or anything, it's just good science. But also the medical, I've had a wonderful privilege today with talking to people doing education here, and they've already cut out huge chunks of basic science from the curriculum, to the great consternation of basic scientists. And what do you do about that? I mean, there's too much to learn to fit into the curriculum, and the kids are already bursting their brains and sometimes worse. What do you do? I think what you do, and I think evolution offers a framework for understanding and memorizing stuff way more easily and having it stick. That requires not a $1 million project, that requires a $5 million project to get it started, doing comparisons between different teaching in different schools, using an evolutionary framework or without an evolutionary framework to test and see if I'm just making this up or if it's for real. That's chump change compared with the amount that's spent studying medical education strategies. So that could be done.
So by and large, I think there are two problems. One is that, and you alluded to this before, is really medical schools now, even from compared to when I was in medical school, they are graded on how well they do on these tests that the students take. And so even now when students are on the wards with me, they will get time off to go study for these tests because the College of Medicine will get graded on how they do. And it drives me crazy because there's nothing they're going to do in that test or can answer that's going to be better than seeing a patient. But the tests drive, right? It drives how they do in the rankings. It drives how they do. And so that's one of the things, right? There's no test for evolutionary medicine. So why would they devote time to that? Right? And so we have to, again, change our mindset.
That is the solution, though.
Right.
If you can get evolution questions on the tests, everything will get fixed.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, and then I think
Some of us lobbied for the MCATs, which you take before medical school, and succeeded in getting evolution questions on. However, the people who accepted the idea clearly didn't know anything about evolution. And so there's work to be done to make sure the questions are actually good ones.
Okay, we're getting close to 7, and I think it's a good time to wrap everything up. So thank you all in the audience for coming and for making this discussion happen. Thank you, Dr. Koshy, Dr. Maisel, and Dr. Nesse for just a fantastic discussion and for a fantastic seminar. Thank you so much.
Hi, emailing you. I'm taking evolutionary psychology, which was Dr. AJ.
I should have been more
You know
clear.
Dr.
I'm not
AJ?
saying don't
I want him over here.
right now. I'm
You
saying
gave a quick and I'm trying to do my
saying
dialogue.
supplement on top of it.
Amy, it's conflict. No, Stephanie, we won't let you in. Let's put in our university.
No, it's
I'm trying to remember. I'm a Vanderbilt girl. And so of course now, after 3 years of statistics and all that.
it just means it dissolves.
Very good. What about the DSM-5 and the
So
culture
what
generation
kind
and
of
then Dr. Fernandez?
Broccoli? Green?
You know about Dr. Jesse White.
Green.
Dr. Are you really? You know, Dr. Stewart is in charge. She's a black. I'm the only black person in your audience.
Okay, sure. Dr. Farah too. Dr. Farah too. If you have both Dr. Farah. Actually, okay. I'm a scientist and actually a drug and math student here today. Try to show some evolutionary concept because I just recently moved in the pharmacology department.
You dragged them to this lecture, did you?
Yeah, I actually I'm with both of us, but I'm working with a student of Dr. Joachim Forst. Maybe you hear about him. You know him?
So which one?
Joachim Forst.
Yes, I'm Kurtz.
You know him?
Oh, very well.
Oh yeah, so we are both his students. So we're not
Are you in this program now or did you graduate?
No, we just graduated. We are the first generation of
I've been sending people to that program.
Oh really? So I'm the first generation, he's the second generation.
So how would you like to make something about your experience?
Sure.
So I run the Evolution of Medicine Review.
Okay.
And I'd like to promote that program. And if you guys would like to get together and say, what we learned, it's the master's degree you took?
PhD, graduate school. Yeah,
In evolutionary medicine. So I think you should just write a few paragraphs about what we learned in our PhD in evolutionary medicine with a link to that site and the application.
We were the evolutionary Munster graduate school.
What?
The Munster graduate school. I think you are referring to the ABLE-PAD, ABLE training group. This actually happened after we graduated. So we were the third generation. We started
So I get a
and
coffee
then
about 5 years ago. You should have been
I
there.
saw your birthday because it was when I was
You would have
studying.
recognized some of those slides.
I worked already about hologenome and
Actually, I'm not sure if it
holobiome.
runs through. I think I might have talked to you. There's three places. I want to feel. Tubing like this?
So we were both work through the review on holobiome, hologenome, and functional reason why you should consider that kind of so but today I brought a student from med school because I started to work at the College of Medicine as an evolutionary scientist.
I was wondering if you had thought about devising, especially at ASU when you have such a large student size, devising some sort of MCAT study guide that was based ecology and evolutionary biology, because I think if you could come up with mnemonics that were biology and evolutionarily based, and if it was to perform much better, that would, I think, attract lots of attention. Yes, because that way, I think it would attract both the medical school and the medical board, because they would see an increase in performance, as well as I think you'd have a lot more undergraduates interested in majoring in.
Couple of people are developing materials, and nobody has suggested that yet. You send me an idea, would you send me an email, that idea, so I can credit you? Any SFA, look around the web, you'll find my email address. It'll remind me to encourage people to do this.
Working at the College of Medicine, I started a lot of students that approached me and asked me like, what did you do in your PhD? And so I talk about evolution because I
So
found
if you notice
evolution.
there's a new book that we add evolution to the curriculum here.
Okay.
Becky Smith is a psychiatrist on the faculty, and I had a really good conversation today with John. Elliott. So he's your interim dean for education for the school. At the curriculum, and he's so talk with them. If you want evolutionary curriculum, they're ready to do it, and I'm ready to help.
I'm not good at it. So yeah, of course, I can drop you an email. In fact, we both are from the Yakin course school. And actually, I think it's really interesting how actually communication is important right now between medicine and science.
So talk with him on it too, so he knows we're in touch.
Yakin course? Yeah. What are we waiting for a review about?
Well, that's an idea.
It's an idea, but
So I think he'll be coming to our sure. I hope so. Yeah, he told me you were.
He told me that he's fun. So we are trying to actually have him here for a talk because we think that would be really.
If you get him here, we'd like to have him come to our center as well.
Okay.
So we can split the cost.
So both my and having PhD supervisor. It's a nice guy.
Well, our center is focusing on immunology.
Oh yeah. I mean, I work on an oxygen paradox. Radical biology and how radical actually is good for you, not all bad. Sometimes to pass that idea, and so having some like medical people like, oh no, radical is bad, it just makes it sound like that. So that was really good. Yeah, sure. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, I'm actually.
I live in the North Bay. I'm